Think knights were noble warriors riding into sunset with their fair maidens? Think again. The medieval knight you've seen in movies is about as accurate as a Disney princess documentary. Real knights weren't gallant heroes, they were essentially armed thugs with expensive metal suits, living in a world so brutal that most modern people wouldn't survive their first day. Here's the thing, everything you think you know about knighthood is wrong. The honor, the glory, the romance, all carefully crafted propaganda. The reality was poverty, disease, violence, and a social system designed to break both body and spirit. Want to know how bad it really was? Let's destroy some myths. Dirt poor. Here's your first reality check. Most knights were broke. Not struggling to pay rent broke. We're talking selling family heirlooms to afford horse feed broke. The medieval economy was rigged against knights from day one. Sure, they got land grants, but here's the catch. That land came with massive obligations. Knights had to provide military service, maintain expensive equipment, support their households, and fund their own wars. It was like getting a job where you pay your employer instead of the other way around. A single suit of armor cost more than a peasant would earn in 15 years. A decent war horse? That's another decade of peasant wages. Add weapons, maintenance, training, and servants, and you're looking at costs that would make modern luxury car payments seem reasonable. Many knights borrowed money just to fulfill their feudal duties. They'd mortgage their lands, pawn their family weapons, and some even sold their daughters into marriage to fund their knightly obligations. The pressure was so intense that entire noble bloodlines went extinct simply because they couldn't afford to keep being knights. The really wealthy lords, they weren't fighting. They were the ones lending money to desperate knights at crushing interest rates. It was medieval capitalism at its most brutal, wrapped in the pretty bow of honor and service. And if a knight got injured and couldn't fight, game over. No disability benefits, no pension, no safety net. Just poverty and shame until death provided the only escape from debt. The romantic image of the wealthy, powerful knight is mostly based on the top 1%, the dukes and earls who could actually afford the lifestyle. Everyone else was just one bad harvest or lost battle away from complete ruin. You don't learn this in history classes out there. The toilet situation. Let's talk about something Hollywood never shows you. How knights handled basic human needs while wrapped in 60 pounds of metal. Going to the bathroom in full armor was a nightmare that required planning, assistance, and a complete abandonment of dignity. Knights couldn't just pop into a restroom. They needed at least 2 servants to help remove armor pieces, and the whole process took about 20 minutes. In the middle of a campaign or siege, this became a logistical disaster. So what did they do? Many knights simply went in their armor. Yes, you heard that right. They'd urinate and defecate inside their metal suits during long battles or sieges. The armor had to be designed with this reality in mind. Some suits included primitive drainage systems and removable padding that could be cleaned later. Castle toilets were communal affairs built over moats or rivers. No privacy, no toilet paper. Just shared wooden seats where knights would sit side by side, conducting business while discussing politics or warfare. The smell was so overwhelming that many castles had separate summer and winter toilet towers to manage the stench. Personal hygiene was equally horrifying. Knights bathed maybe 3 or 4 times a year, believing that too much washing would weaken their bodies and make them vulnerable to disease. They'd wear the same undergarments for months, creating breeding grounds for lice, fleas, and infections that could kill as effectively as any sword. Their solution to body odor? Heavy perfumes and spices that only mask the smell while creating nauseating combinations. Imagine sitting next to someone who hasn't bathed in months but doused themselves in medieval cologne. That's your typical knight. And here's the really disturbing part. They thought this was normal. Clean people were considered weak, vain, and possibly heretical. Being filthy was a sign of martial virtue and religious devotion. Cooking alive. Medieval armor wasn't just heavy. It was a death trap that turned knights into walking ovens. Full plate armor could reach internal temperatures of over 120 degrees Fahrenheit on a normal day. In direct sunlight, or during summer campaigns, knights regularly died from heat exhaustion before they ever faced an enemy. Their own equipment was killing them faster than opposing armies. The metal absorbed and trapped heat so efficiently that knights would literally cook inside their suits. Sweating became deadly because there was nowhere for moisture to escape. It just pooled inside the armor, creating a humid hell that made breathing nearly impossible. Many knights suffocated on their own sweat. During the Crusades, European knights dropped like flies in the Middle Eastern heat. Entire formations would collapse, not from arrows or swords, but from hyperthermia. The metal armor that protected them in cool European climates became instruments of torture in desert warfare. Knights developed desperate cooling strategies that sound like medieval torture methods. They'd have servants pour cold water through gaps in their armor, but this only worked temporarily and made the metal conduct heat even more efficiently. Some tried wearing ice-soaked cloth underneath, but this created frostbite in winter and just melted immediately in summer. The really smart knights learned to fight in the early morning or late evening, but medieval warfare rarely followed convenient schedules. Battles happened when they happened, and knights had to choose between protection and survival. Here's the insane part. They knew the armor was killing them, but taking it off meant certain death from enemy weapons. So they chose slow cooking over quick stabbing, gambling that they could finish the fight before their own equipment finished them. Many knights developed permanent heat-related health problems, kidney damage, heart conditions, and neurological issues from repeated overheating. The lucky ones just passed out and missed the battle entirely. Ultimate Knighting Championship. Medieval tournaments weren't sporting events. They were legalized murder disguised as entertainment. What we call tournaments today were originally called melees, and they were basically organized wars with spectators. Knights would gather in massive free-for-alls where the only rule was try not to kill too many people. Emphasis on try. The death rate at these events was staggering. A single tournament could kill dozens of knights and injure hundreds more. The famous tournament at Chauvency in 1285 left over 60 knights dead in a single day. Crowds cheered as men were trampled by horses, crushed by fallen opponents, or simply beaten to death with blunt weapons. But here's the twisted part. Losing didn't just mean injury or death. Defeated knights had to surrender their horses, armor, and weapons to the winners. For broke knights, this meant total financial ruin. Many knights literally died trying to avoid bankruptcy, fighting beyond their limits because surrender meant their families would starve. The weapons used weren't dulled or modified for safety. Knights fought with sharpened swords, real lances, and war hammers designed to crush skulls through helmets. Blunt weapons were still perfectly capable of shattering bones and pulverizing organs. Medical care at tournaments consisted of monks saying prayers over mangled bodies. If you got knocked unconscious, they'd wait to see if you woke up. If you didn't wake up within a few hours, they'd start planning your funeral. The spectacle was so brutal that even medieval people, who were used to public executions and religious torture, sometimes found tournaments too violent to watch. Chroniclers describe audiences vomiting from the carnage and women fainting at the sight of knights being literally torn apart. Yet knights kept participating because the alternative, admitting you were too scared to fight, meant social suicide. Better to die in the arena than live as a coward. The ransom business. Knights weren't just warriors. They were professional kidnappers running a medieval extortion racket. Capturing enemy knights alive was more profitable than killing them. So medieval battlefields became bizarre hunting grounds where knights tried to knock each other unconscious rather than deliver killing blows. It was like a violent treasure hunt where the treasure could fight back. The ransom system was so complex it required its own medieval accountants. A knight's ransom was calculated based on their social rank, land holdings, family wealth, and political importance. Some ransoms were worth more than entire villages. We're talking about medieval fortunes that would bankrupt kingdoms. But here's where it gets really dark. Knights would deliberately target wealthy opponents, sometimes ignoring military objectives just to chase a profitable capture. Battles were won and lost because knights got distracted by ransom opportunities instead of following orders. The psychological torture was intentional. Captured knights were kept in comfortable prisons, fed well, given books, allowed to exercise, specifically to keep them valuable. But they knew that if their families couldn't pay, they'd either be sold to someone who could or simply executed after years of false hope. Some knights spent decades in captivity. King John II of France was held for 4 years after being captured at the Battle of Poitiers. His ransom was so enormous it nearly bankrupted France and required raising taxes that sparked peasant revolts. The really twisted part? Knights often became friends with their captors during long imprisonments, then had to return to battle and potentially fight the same people who'd been hosting them for years. Medieval warfare was basically a violent social club where today's enemy was tomorrow's dinner guest. Failed ransom attempts could destroy entire bloodlines. Families would sell everything: land, livestock, daughters' dowries, trying to buy back their captured relatives. Some noble houses went extinct not from warfare, but from ransom debt. Religious warrior contradictions. Knights were supposed to be holy warriors, but they spent most of their time doing things that would make demons blush. The Catholic Church created this bizarre mental framework where mass murder became a religious duty. Knights were told that killing infidels, heretics, and enemies of the faith would guarantee them a spot in heaven. Basically, a medieval get-out-of-hell free card for professional killers. But here's the psychological nightmare. These same knights had to reconcile brutal violence with Christian teachings about love, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek. The mental gymnastics required to justify slaughtering entire villages while claiming to serve the Prince of Peace broke many minds. During the Crusades, knights would spend mornings praying for God's blessing, then afternoons massacring civilians. They'd attend Mass covered in blood, receive communion with the same hands that had just strangled prisoners, and sleep peacefully believing they were doing God's work. The Church developed elaborate rituals to cleanse knights of their sins. Special masses, indulgences, and pilgrimages were designed to wash away the psychological stain of warfare. But these solutions often just made knights feel entitled to commit even more violence. Many knights developed what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. But medieval society interpreted these symptoms as either divine punishment or demonic possession. Knights who couldn't handle the contradiction between faith and violence were often declared heretics or madmen. Some knights snapped completely and became religious fanatics, seeing enemies everywhere and interpreting every conflict as a holy war. Others abandoned faith entirely, becoming cynical killers who used religious language to justify personal brutality. The most disturbing cases were knights who genuinely believed they were saints while committing atrocities. They'd torture prisoners while reciting prayers, burn villages while singing hymns, and rape women while claiming to purify them of sin. Medieval chroniclers are full of stories about knights who went insane trying to resolve these contradictions, talking to imaginary angels, having violent religious visions, or simply withdrawing from society entirely to become hermits. When knights went rogue, chivalry was basically a medieval PR campaign designed to control armed psychopaths, and it failed spectacularly. When knights couldn't afford their lifestyle through legitimate means, many turned to what they called private warfare, which was just a fancy term for organized crime. These weren't isolated incidents. Entire regions were terrorized by bands of rogue knights who'd abandoned any pretense of honor. Knights would set up illegal toll roads, demanding payment from merchants and travelers at sword point. They'd occupy abandoned castles and turn them into bandit fortresses, launching raids against nearby villages like medieval crime bosses. Some even issued their own currency and established protection rackets that would make modern mobsters proud. The most notorious example was Götz von Berlichingen, a German knight who spent decades as essentially a medieval warlord. He kidnapped merchants, extorted cities, and fought private wars against anyone who crossed him. When authorities tried to stop him, he'd claim he was defending his honor. The medieval equivalent of, it's nothing personal, just business. During the 100 Years' War, unemployed knights formed mercenary companies that switched sides based on who paid better. These free companies would sack French villages in the morning, then raid English supply lines in the afternoon, showing loyalty only to profit. The peasants suffered most from rogue knights because they had no legal protection. A knight could rape, murder, and steal from commoners with minimal consequences. After all, who was going to stop a trained killer in full armor? Local lords often ignored peasant complaints because they needed knights' military service. Some regions became so lawless that legitimate knights couldn't travel safely. The very system designed to protect society had created armed predators who preyed on the weak. Medieval chronicles describe entire counties where no merchant dared travel, and no peasant worked fields without armed guards. The church tried to control this chaos through peace of God movements, threatening excommunication for knights who attacked civilians. But desperate men in expensive armor don't care about religious threats when they're facing starvation. So the next time you think modern life is tough, remember that medieval knights lived in a world where your job could literally cook you alive, bankruptcy meant death, and being a holy warrior required becoming a professional psychopath. Today's soldiers have Geneva Conventions, medical care, and psychological support. Medieval knights had prayer, primitive surgery, and the constant threat of financial ruin. We complain about work-life balance. They couldn't even balance staying alive with staying employed. The romantic image of knighthood is one of history's most successful marketing campaigns, but the reality was poverty, violence, and moral contradictions that destroyed both body and soul. Makes you appreciate modern problems, doesn't it? At least your worst day at the office doesn't involve getting kidnapped for ransom or slowly roasting in metal underwear. Want more historical reality checks that'll make you grateful for the 21st century? Hit that subscribe button, because apparently the past really wasn't the good old days.